The dust in Clearwater, Texas could kill a man. It got in your lungs, in your food, in your soul. Jackson Wade stood on the railway platform, tasting the grit on his teeth. He'd spent his life on the plains, a place where the rules were simple. Work hard, stay honest, and don't expect much. At 32, he had a ranch, a small herd, and a deep-seated loneliness that felt as vast as the Texas sky. Everyone in town had an opinion. "A man needs a wife, Jack," they'd say. "Someone quiet and proper, someone to make a home." So he'd made a deal, not with the devil, but with his cousin Martha back east, which felt pretty close. She'd found him a bride, Eleanor Prescott, 23, educated, and, according to the letters, as modest and reserved as a church mouse. The perfect woman to bring a little peace to his rough and tumble life. Then the train whistle screamed. The iron horse thundered into the station, hissing steam and spitting smoke. Jackson's heart hammered against his ribs, a wild stampede in his chest. He scanned the passengers descending into the heat. City men in stiff suits, a tired family with crying kids, a pair of saloon girls laughing a little too loud. And then he saw her. She stepped off that train, and the whole dusty platform might as well have been a palace ballroom. Her dress was deep blue, buttoned right up to her throat, just like a proper lady's. Her dark hair was swept up under a sensible bonnet. She was everything Martha had promised. Quiet, beautiful, a woman who knew her place. But then she turned, and Jackson's world tilted on its axis. Her eyes met his across the crowd. They weren't the downcast, shy eyes of a church mouse. They were green, green as new grass after a spring rain, and they held a fire in them, a wild, untamed spark that made his breath catch in his throat. It was the look of a Mustang that had been saddled but had never, ever been broken. She didn't look away. Instead, she studied him. Her gaze was so intense, it felt like she was looking straight through his dusty clothes and trail-worn skin, right into the lonely corners of his soul. It was the look of a woman who wasn't just accepting her fate, she was sizing it up. Then the corner of her mouth quirked into a smile that was anything but modest. It was a smile that held a secret, a challenge. "Mr. Wade?" Her voice cut through the noise of the station. It was cultured, smooth as silk, but there was a core of steel beneath it. "Yes, ma'am. Miss Prescott," he managed, pulling off his hat. He was suddenly aware of the dirt under his nails, the sweat staining his collar. "Eleanor," she corrected, extending a gloved hand. Her grip was firm, solid, not the delicate touch he'd expected. "I trust you received my letter about the arrangements." "Yes, ma'am. The Reverend Morrison is expecting us." The words felt clumsy on his tongue. He was talking about his own wedding like it was a cattle deal. She nodded, but her eyes were already moving, taking in the shabby frontier town, the saloon with its swinging doors, the cowboys lounging in the shade, the proper ladies who were already whispering behind their fans as they looked her over. "It's smaller than I imagined," she said. "It's growing," Jackson found himself saying, feeling a strange need to defend the place. "Got a new school last year." "How progressive," she murmured, and he couldn't tell if she was being sincere or sarcastic. Before he could decide, she turned that challenging smile back on him. "Shall we collect my trunk? I assume you're eager to complete the formalities." The way she said formalities made his skin prickle. He signaled for help with her luggage, a single heavy trunk and a carpet bag. As they loaded it onto his wagon, he saw something odd. Scratches near the lock, as if someone had tried to pry it open. He filed it away. She watched everything, those sharp green eyes missing nothing. It wasn't the gaze of a frightened woman in a new place. It was the look of a scout assessing enemy territory. The ride to the church was mostly silent. Eleanor sat beside him, straight-backed and composed, but he saw her fingers tighten in her lap, the only sign of nerves. "Your cousin Martha spoke highly of you," she said as they neared the church. "Martha tends to exaggerate," he replied. "I'm just a man with a piece of land." "She said you were honest," Eleanor said, turning to look him straight in the eye. "That matters more than the size of your herd." Her directness was a punch to the gut. This wasn't the woman he'd been promised. This wasn't the quiet, gentle bride who would need his protection. This was something else entirely. Something wild. The wedding was a blur. Reverend Morrison mumbled the words, sweating in the cool evening air. The only witnesses were his wife and the town clerk. Eleanor spoke her vows in a voice that was clear and steady as a rifle shot, her eyes never leaving his. When it came time for the kiss, she didn't shrink away. She lifted her chin, almost defiantly, and met his lips. It was a soft touch, but it felt less like a submission and more like a declaration. As they signed the register, he noticed her handwriting. Strong, flowing, confident. Next to his own cramped scrawl, it looked like a general's signature on a treaty. Mrs. Morrison pressed a bundle of biscuits into her hands, her eyes full of pity, as if Eleanor were being led to a hanging instead of a home. But the real shock came as they were leaving the church. A man stood in the shadows across the street, a stranger dressed in city clothes that looked out of place in Clearwater. He wasn't watching the church. He was watching Eleanor. And when her eyes met the stranger's, Jackson saw a flicker of something pass between them. Not recognition. Fear. She turned away so quickly he almost thought he'd imagined it. But the image was seared into his mind. The stranger's hard face and the sudden terror in his new wife's eyes. The sun was setting as they drove north to the ranch. The prairie was painted in gold and blood red, beautiful and unforgiving. Jackson could feel the tension radiating from Eleanor, a living thing in the space between them. "It's not much," he said as the log house came into view, "but it's solid. The roof doesn't leak." "It's perfect," she said, and her voice held a note of genuine relief that surprised him. "You built this yourself?" "With some help." He pulled the wagon to a stop and helped her down. For a moment she was pressed against him, and he smelled lavender mixed with something wilder, like sagebrush after a storm. He felt the strength in her arms, the solid muscle beneath the fine dress. She was no delicate flower. She stepped away quickly. Inside, the house was simple. One main room, a small kitchen area, a single bedroom. He'd cleaned for her arrival, but now it felt crude, rough, not fit for an Eastern lady. But Eleanor didn't seem to notice. "I'll start supper," she said, moving to the kitchen and removing her gloves with brisk, efficient movements. She found his supplies, bacon, beans, cornmeal, and began to work with a confidence that stunned him. This wasn't a woman who was used to having servants. While she cooked, Jackson tended the horses, his mind churning. He'd imagined a wedding night with a shy, blushing bride he would have to coax and comfort. Instead, he had a wife who moved through his home like she was taking possession of a fortress. Supper was quiet. The food was simple, but perfectly cooked. They ate by the light of a single lamp, the unspoken questions hanging heavy in the air. He kept catching her looking at him across the small table, and in her eyes he saw no fear, no hesitation. He saw anticipation. After the dishes were cleared, they stood facing each other in the firelight. The bedroom door stood open. Jackson cleared his throat. "I know this is, sudden. If you need some time to adjust." She took a step closer. In the lamplight, he could see tiny gold flecks in her green eyes. "Mr. Wade, Jackson, I believe you've made some assumptions about me." "Ma'am," he croaked. Her hands went to her hair, pulling out the pins with practiced speed. A cascade of dark hair tumbled over her shoulders, and his mouth went dry. "You advertised for a quiet wife," she said, her voice a low murmur. "Someone modest and beautiful." "That's right," he managed to say. Then she smiled, and it was a smile that transformed her. It wasn't just pretty, it was breathtaking. It was the smile of a predator, of a woman who held a winning hand and was just about to lay her cards on the table. "Tell me, Jackson," she said, moving closer still, until he could feel the warmth of her body. "What made you think a truly quiet woman would answer an advertisement to marry a stranger and travel 1,000 miles to the edge of the world?" Before he could even form an answer, she laid a hand flat on his chest. He felt the touch like a brand through his shirt. She leaned in, her lips brushing his ear, her voice a husky whisper full of promise and danger. "Cowboy wanted a quiet wife," she breathed. "Got a wild one who wrote him, till dawn." The words were a spark to dry tinder. Fire raced through his veins. As she took his hand, her fingers twining with his, and led him toward the bedroom. Jackson Wade knew one thing for certain. Everything he thought he wanted, everything he thought he knew about the woman he had just married, was wrong. The night stretched out before them, a dark, uncharted territory. And for the first time in his steady, predictable life, the cowboy felt like he was the one being tamed. Outside, the coyotes howled their wild song to the rising moon. But inside the small log house, a different kind of wildness was just beginning. Jackson woke to the first rays of sun slanting through the window. He was alone in the bed. For a panicked moment, he thought she was gone, that the whole night had been a fever dream. Then he heard movement from the main room, the smell of coffee and frying bacon. He'd expected to slip out and do the morning chores before his new, delicate wife was even awake. He pulled on his pants and walked into a scene that stopped him dead. Eleanor was at the hearth, but she wasn't wearing the fine blue dress. She was dressed in a split riding skirt and a practical blouse, clothes he hadn't seen in her trunk. And in her hand wasn't a stirring spoon. It was a pistol, a Colt Peacemaker. She was cleaning it with an expert's touch, the pieces laid out on a cloth on the table. She looked up as he entered, her eyes alert and amused. Not a hint of shame or apology in her expression. "Running away already, cowboy?" she asked, her voice still husky from sleep. "Cattle need tending," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the gun. Where did you get that?" "It came with the trunk," she said, snapping the cylinder back into place with a practiced flick of her wrist. She stood and stretched like a cat, graceful and utterly shameless in the morning light. "If I wanted to rest and look pretty, I'd have married a banker in Philadelphia." She strapped the gun belt around her waist, the holster settling on her hip as if it had always belonged there. "An hour of daylight is an hour of work wasted," she declared, grabbing 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to him. "Now, are you going to stand there looking like a stunned mullet, or are you going to show me my horse?" He followed her out to the corral, his mind struggling to catch up. "My horse? Eleanor, these aren't gentle riding school ponies," he said, gesturing to the restless animals. "They're half wild." She was already at the fence, her eyes scanning the herd with a knowledge that went far beyond casual admiration. "That bay mare," she said, pointing. "She's got spirit, good legs, intelligent eyes. What's her name?" "Rosalita," he answered automatically. "But she's got a mean streak. Threw me twice last month." "Then she just needs to know who's boss," Eleanor said, and before he could stop her, she slipped between the fence rails. The horses shied away, their ears flat, but Eleanor moved with a calm, deliberate confidence. She didn't approach Rosalita head-on. She moved with the herd, speaking in a low, steady voice, a soft murmur that was more about tone than words. The mare's ears pricked forward. Her tail stopped swishing. Within minutes, Eleanor had a hand on the horse's neck, stroking her, calming her. "Saddle," she said over her shoulder, not a request but a command. Wordlessly, Jackson fetched the tack from the barn. He watched, completely mesmerized, as she saddled the difficult mare. Her movements were swift and sure, no hesitation. She didn't just know how to saddle a horse, she understood the animal. When she swung into the saddle, Rosalita danced sideways, testing her, trying to unseat her. Eleanor sat deep, her body moving with the horse, her hands light and steady on the reins. She wasn't fighting the mare. She was leading her. She grinned down at him, a triumphant, wild smile that made his heart do a flip. "Well, are you coming? Or should I go check the herd by myself?" They rode out across the prairie, Jackson on his steady gelding, Caesar feeling like a stranger on his own land. He kept waiting for her to get into trouble, for Rosalita to bolt. It never happened. Eleanor rode as if she'd been born in a saddle. When they reached the cattle, she gave a low whistle of appreciation. "Good stock. Longhorn, but you've crossed them. Some Hereford blood?" "You know cattle?" he asked, amazed. "My uncle raised horses in Kentucky. I spent my summers there." She scanned the grazing animals. "Of course, he would have been horrified to see me actually working. That was men's work." "It still is," Jackson said before he could stop himself. Her laugh rang out, clear and sharp in the open air. "According to who? A bunch of old men in suits and women in corsets who think the world should be neat and tidy?" Their morning was a series of shocks. A cow had a festering wound on its flank. Screwworms. Jackson knew he'd have to rope her to treat it. Before he could even reach for his lariat, Eleanor had wheeled Rosalita around, snatched the rope from his own saddle, and built a loop. She sent it sailing. It wasn't a perfect throw. It caught the cow's horns instead of its neck. But it held. Where in the hell did you learn to do that? The curse slipped out. He was supposed to be the rough cowboy. She was the Eastern lady. Kentucky, she said, already taking dallies around her saddle horn as the cow fought the rope. My uncle thought it was a funny trick to teach a girl. My aunt nearly fainted. They treated the wound together, Eleanor holding a full-grown angry cow steady with practiced skill, while Jackson applied the carbolic acid. Her hands were steady, her voice calm as she soothed the animal. As they coiled the rope, he found his voice. Your throw needs work. Then teach me, she said simply. The request threw him. The women in town, they didn't ask to learn men's skills. They asked for help, for protection. They created a soft place in a hard world. Eleanor seemed determined to meet the hard world on its own terms. All right, he heard himself say. They spent the next hour practicing, him showing her the flick of the wrist, the timing. Her aim improved with astonishing speed. She was a natural. When she finally dropped a perfect loop over a fence post from 20 feet away, her whoop of triumph echoed across the plains, and Jackson felt a reluctant smile spread across his face. On the ride back, they passed the neighboring Hendricks spread. Mary Hendricks was out hanging laundry, her children playing in the dust. She saw them coming and her jaw dropped. She wasn't looking at Jackson. She was staring at Eleanor, sitting astride her horse like a man, her clothes practical, her face smudged with dust. Morning, Mary, Jackson called out. Jackson? Mary's voice was stiff with disapproval. Her eyes raked over Eleanor, judging and dismissing her in a single glance. Please call me Eleanor, Eleanor said, her smile polite but with an edge of steel Jackson was beginning to recognize. You have lovely children. Thank you, Mary replied, her tone frosty. I'm sure you'll be blessed with your own soon. Then you'll have more appropriate things to do with your time. Eleanor's back went ramrod straight. How fortunate that we each get to define appropriate for ourselves. They rode on, leaving Mary Hendricks gaping in their dust. Jackson could feel the gossip already starting, spreading through Clearwater like a prairie fire. Jackson Wade's new bride wasn't just from the East. She was an oddity, a scandal. She's not wrong, he said quietly. People are going to talk. Let them, Eleanor's voice was fierce. I didn't come 1,000 miles to be put in a cage. That afternoon, she insisted on helping him mend a section of fence. Her gloved hands, which he'd assumed were for needlepoint and playing the piano, struggled with the wire stretchers. But she didn't give up. When he saw a blister forming on her palm and told her she'd done enough, she fixed him with that fiery gaze. Would you stop if you were tired? She challenged. That's different. Why? He had no answer for her. The week passed in a haze of discovery. By day, she was his partner. She worked as hard as he did, learning fast, never complaining. She threw herself into the work of the ranch with a kind of desperate passion, as if she was trying to outrun something. But at night, in the darkness of their small bedroom, she was a different kind of mystery. She was passionate, demanding, teaching him that desire wasn't a one-way street. It was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. He had sent for a quiet wife, a comfort. He had gotten a storm. One evening, he came back from town to find her in the corral, gentling a young colt. Ran into Reverend Morrison, he said, leaning on the fence. He asked if you'd be joining the Ladies' Aid Society. They sew clothes for the poor on Wednesdays. Eleanor didn't look up from the horse. I'd rather be shot. It would help you make friends? Would it? She finally turned to face him, the colt's lead rope held loosely in her hand. What kind of friends, Jackson? The kind who would smile to my face and then whisper about how unnatural I am behind their fans the second I left the room? Not everyone is like that. No, she agreed, turning back to the colt. Some are worse. I will not pretend to be something I'm not. Not for you, not for them, not for anyone. Damn it, Eleanor, I'm trying to help you fit in. I don't need your help. The words exploded from her, raw and angry. The colt shied, and she immediately softened her voice, soothing the animal. When she looked back at him, her eyes were glistening. I don't need a protector, Jackson. I need a partner. They stood there, the setting sun casting long shadows between them. The distance across the dusty corral felt as wide as the Grand Canyon. That night, she didn't come to bed right away. He lay in the darkness, listening to her move around the main room. When she finally slipped under the covers, she stayed on her side of the bed, a cold, deliberate space between them. He thought she was asleep. Then she whispered into the darkness, I can't be what they want me to be. I tried back east. God, how I tried. But it's like wearing shoes that are too small. At first, it just pinches. But if you wear them long enough, they cripple you. Jackson stared at the rough-hewn ceiling, his heart aching with a confusion he couldn't name. He had wanted simple. He had wanted peace. He had gotten Eleanor. Brilliant, impossible, infuriating Eleanor. I know, he said, the words surprising him, and in that moment he realized it was true. The very things that made her an outcast in Clearwater were the things that fascinated him, that drew him in. The fire, the strength, the refusal to be broken. I think I knew it the second you stepped off that train, he admitted. She rolled over, her hand finding his in the dark. So, where does that leave us? I don't know, he said honestly, but I figure we'll work it out. Together. Together. She moved into his arms and he held her tight. The prairie outside was vast and dangerous, full of predators and harsh weather. But for the first time, Jackson Wade felt like the real wilderness was the woman he held in his arms, and he was just beginning to explore it. The drought came on slowly, a thief in the night. First, the spring rains were sparse, then they stopped altogether. By late June, the land was gasping for life. The grass, once green and lush, turned the color of old straw. It crunched under the horses' hooves like broken glass. The sky was a relentless, searing blue, a beautiful, terrible curse that offered no hope. Jackson stood on his porch at dawn, the air already thick and hot, and watched heat waves shimmer over the horizon. The creek, the lifeblood of his ranch, was down to a muddy trickle. How long? Eleanor's voice came from behind him. She handed him a cup of coffee. In 3 months of marriage, she'd learned to read the set of his shoulders, the hard line of his jaw. 6 weeks, and he said, taking the cup. Maybe 7. How bad is it? She didn't want comfort. She wanted the truth. It's bad, he admitted. If the creek dries up completely, then we'll haul water from the river, she said, her voice firm, unwavering. It's only 5 miles. 5 miles hauling water for 30 head of cattle might as well be the moon, Eleanor. She didn't argue. She just laid her hand on his arm. Her palm wasn't soft anymore. It was calloused, work-roughened, the hands of a rancher, not an Eastern lady. We'll manage, she said. We always do. But managing became a living hell. The creek bed turned from mud to cracked, baked earth that looked like a shattered plate. Every single morning, they loaded barrels onto the wagon and began the grueling trek to the river. The riverbank was a gathering place of grim faces. Other ranchers, their faces etched with the same worry that haunted Jackson's sleep. The water level was dropping there too, revealing sun-bleached rocks that hadn't seen the sky in years. Eleanor worked beside him, never complaining. Her split skirts were caked in mud, her face flushed from the heat. She hauled buckets with a grim determination that silenced the other ranchers. Their wives, when they came at all, sat in the shade of their wagons, fluttering fans and whispering. That's a man's work, Jackson heard Sarah Morrison, the preacher's wife, say one morning, her voice carrying on the still air. Before Eleanor could reply, Jackson spoke, his voice loud and clear. Then it's a good thing I married a woman who's as strong as any man. The other men looked away, but Eleanor flashed him a quick, grateful smile that made the back-breaking labor feel a little lighter. He was starting to realize that her strength wasn't a liability. It was their greatest asset. But their strength couldn't save the cattle. They started losing them. A calf too weak to stand. A cow mired in the last of the mud in a desperate search for water. Jackson had to put down 3 animals in a single week. Each gunshot was an admission of failure, an echo of defeat across the dying land. He found her one evening by the dry creek bed, her shoulders shaking. It was the first time he'd seen her cry. She wasn't making a sound, just silent tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "Hey now," he said softly, sitting beside her. "That calf this morning," she whispered, her voice raw. "She had such beautiful eyes. This is harder than I thought." He took a breath. "You could go back east. No one would blame you. This isn't the life you signed up for." Her head snapped up, the grief in her eyes instantly replaced by fire. "Is that what you want, Jackson? For me to run away when things get hard?" "No!" The word burst out of him, more forceful than he intended. "No, that's not what I want at all." "Then don't you dare insult me by suggesting I'm too weak for this." She scrambled to her feet, dusting off her skirt with angry, jerky movements. "I chose this. I chose you. And I'll be damned if I let a little dry spell send me running back with my tail between my legs." He couldn't help it. A dry laugh escaped him. "A little dry spell? Eleanor, this is the worst drought in a decade." "Then we'd better stop feeling sorry for ourselves and figure out how to beat it," she shot back. Her fierce spirit was contagious. That night they didn't sleep. They planned. By the light of a kerosene lamp, they mapped out a strategy for survival. It was Eleanor who came up with the idea of selling off part of the herd. "Henderson's been buying up stock to drive north," she said, tapping a pencil against her lips. "Henderson's a vulture. He'll pay half what they're worth." "Half of something is better than all of nothing," she said, her green eyes boring into his. "Your pride won't keep the rest of our cattle alive, Jackson." She was right. It galled him, but she was right. The next day they drove 10 head to Henderson's ranch. The man's smile was slick with greed. He named a price that was nothing short of robbery. Jackson's fists clenched at his sides. "That's daylight robbery," he growled. "It's business," Henderson said, picking his teeth with a gold toothpick. "Take it or leave it." Before Jackson could tell him where to shove his offer, Eleanor stepped forward, placing a calming hand on his arm. "We'll take it," she said, her voice smooth as ice. "On one condition, you pay us in cash. Now." Henderson's eyes narrowed, but he agreed. As he went to get the money, Eleanor murmured, "He would have found a way to cheat us on the note. Never trust a man with a gold toothpick." The money bought them feed and a little time, but August arrived like a blast from a furnace. The world turned to shades of brown and gray. Dust devils danced across the barren fields. The air smelled of dust and death. Eleanor grew thin, her face gaunt, but her eyes never lost their fire. One afternoon, the wealthiest rancher in the county, Samuel Garrett, rode up. He sat on his pristine horse like a king, his clothes impossibly clean in the filthy world. "Wade," he nodded, his gaze sweeping over Eleanor with open disdain. "I'm making offers, buying out the smaller spreads before you all lose everything." "We're not selling," Jackson said. "You sure?" Garrett's smile was cruel. "I hear you're down to 20 head, and with a distraction." His eyes flicked to Eleanor. "An unconventional wife who thinks she's a ranch hand. A man in your position can't afford distractions." Before Jackson could explode, Eleanor stepped forward. "And some might say a man who preys on his neighbor's misfortune is no better than a carrion crow." Garrett's face turned purple. "You'd do well to teach your woman some manners, Wade." "My woman doesn't need teaching," Jackson said, moving to stand shoulder to shoulder with her. "And we're not selling." "We'll see," Garrett snarled as he wheeled his horse around. "When you're bearing your last cow and that pretty wife of yours is begging for a sip of water, you'll remember my offer." As he rode away, Eleanor spat in the dust. "Bastard." "Eleanor!" Jackson was shocked. "What?" "He is." She turned back to reinforcing the well, her movements sharp with anger. "We will die on this land before we sell it to him." That very night, the wind began to howl. It wasn't rain. It was a dust storm, a monstrous, churning wall of sand and grit that descended upon them. For 3 days they huddled in the house, rags tied over their faces to keep from choking, listening to the miserable bawling of the cattle. When it finally passed, the world was buried, and 2 more cows were dead, their lungs filled with dust. Standing over the carcasses, Jackson felt something inside him finally break. Maybe Garrett was right. Maybe we should just sell. No. Eleanor's voice was a raw whisper, but it was as unmovable as a mountain. Eleanor, be reasonable. We can't fight the sky itself. Then we fight harder. She grabbed his shoulders, forcing him to look at her dust-caked face, her blazing eyes. You built this ranch with your own two hands. We will not hand it over to that vulture because things got hard. What if we lose everything? He choked out. Then we lose it together, she said, her voice fierce. Fighting. That was the deal, wasn't it? Together. Looking at her, exhausted, filthy, but utterly unbroken, he felt his own broken spirit begin to mend. This life wasn't what he'd expected. It wasn't quiet or peaceful. It was a constant battle. But with her by his side, it was a battle worth fighting. Together, he agreed, pulling her into his arms. That evening, as if in answer, a miracle appeared on the horizon. Clouds. Just a few wisps at first, then great towering thunderheads of purple and gray. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of ozone. The first drop of rain hit the porch roof with a loud splat. Then another, and another. Soon the sky opened up. A torrential downpour, a deluge that turned the dust to mud in minutes. They ran out into it, laughing and crying, their faces turned up to the heavens, letting the cool, clean water wash away the weeks of grime and despair. Eleanor threw her arms around his neck and kissed him, a hard, desperate kiss tasting of rain and relief. See? She gasped against his lips. We just had to outlast it. The drought wasn't over. One storm couldn't erase months of damage. But as they worked late into the night, channeling the precious water into barrels in their nearly empty well, Jackson knew they had survived, not because of the rain, but because of her. Later, sitting by the fire, wrapped in blankets, Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder. Garrett will be back, she said quietly. I know, he answered, kissing her damp hair. This isn't over. No, she agreed, but neither are we. Eleanor told him about the baby on a crisp October morning. Jackson was in the barn, mending a bridle, the familiar scent of leather and hay filling the air. She appeared in the doorway, a silhouette against the bright sun. Something about the way she stood, her stillness, made him put down his tools. We need to talk, she said. Her voice was steady, but he heard an unfamiliar note in it. Uncertainty. He was on his feet in an instant. What's wrong? Are you sick? Not exactly. She stepped into the barn, her hands clasped in front of her. He'd never seen her look so hesitant. Jackson, I'm going to have a child. The words seemed to hang in the dusty, sunlit air. A child. His child. Their child. A wave of something. Joy, terror, disbelief washed over him, so strong his knees felt weak. He sat down heavily on a hay bale. Are you sure? Doc Henley confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. I'm about 2 months along. The baby will come in the spring. Spring. A new life to go with the new grass. It felt right. But his mind was already racing. The ranch was just starting to recover. They'd lost nearly half the herd in the drought. Money was tighter than a new pair of boots. This changes things, he said slowly. Her chin came up in that familiar, defiant way. Does it? Of course it does. You can't keep working like this. Roping cattle, breaking horses. It's not safe. Women have been having babies on the frontier since the first wagon train crossed the Mississippi, Jackson. I'm not made of glass. But you have to be careful, he insisted. You have to think of the baby. I am thinking of the baby. Her hands went to her still, flat stomach, a fiercely protective gesture. What kind of mother would I be if I taught my child that you're supposed to give up who you are the second life presents a challenge? They stared at each other. It was the same argument they'd been having since she arrived. His ingrained need to protect, to follow the rules of society, and her absolute refusal to be put in a box. The women in town already think I'm an unnatural wife, she continued, her voice softer, but no less firm. Can you imagine what they'll say when they see me mending fences with a baby in my belly? Maybe it's time we stopped worrying about what they think, he said, the words surprising even himself. Eleanor blinked. Do you mean that? He ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. I don't know what I mean anymore. All I know is, I want you and this baby to be safe. We will be, she promised, stepping closer and taking his rough hands in hers. I'll be careful, Jackson. I promise. But I won't become someone else. He pulled her close, resting his cheek against her belly, where their future was quietly growing. I'm scared, he admitted in a whisper. Me too, she whispered back, her hand stroking his hair. But we'll face it, together, like always. The news spread through Clearwater faster than a summer cold. By Sunday, the church was packed. Every woman in town seemed to be craning her neck to get a look at Eleanor, searching for any sign of her condition. The whispers were a low buzz under the Reverend's sermon. Perhaps now she'll settle down, Mary Hendricks murmured, loud enough for them to hear. A baby changes a woman, Sarah Morrison added sagely. Eleanor's hand tightened on his arm, but she kept her face forward, her expression serene as a saint. Only he could feel the rage vibrating through her. After the service, they were swarmed, a flock of hens, clucking with unsolicited advice. Eleanor should rest more. She should avoid riding. She should stop wearing those scandalous split skirts and take up embroidery. Eleanor smiled and nodded and said nothing, but Jackson could see the storm gathering behind her eyes. The explosion came on the ride home. A baby changes a woman, she mimicked, her voice sharp with fury. As if I don't know that. As if I haven't spent every waking moment terrified of what this means. They don't want me to change, Jackson. They want me to disappear. To fold myself up into a neat, quiet, proper little package until I barely exist at all. Her voice broke. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm selfish for wanting to be more than just a mother. He pulled his horse to a stop and reached over, taking the reins of her mare. Look at me. Tears were threatening to spill from her eyes when she finally met his gaze. You are the least selfish person I have ever known, he said, his voice low and intense. You work this ranch back from the brink of death. You will be a wonderful mother. You might be different from them, but you will be wonderful. The tears fell then, but she was laughing through them. These moods, Doc Henley says they're normal. I feel like I'm going crazy. Only half crazy, he teased gently. That's an improvement. She swatted at him, but she was smiling. As her body changed, she adapted. She gave up the heaviest chores but refused to be idle. She took over the ranch's books, her sharp mind finding ways to save money he'd never seen. She mended tack with meticulous care. She designed her own maternity riding skirts, refusing to give up the saddle. The sight of her, belly swollen with his child, still fiercely independent, filled him with a love so powerful it almost hurt. The inevitable confrontation happened in early December. Eleanor had ridden to town for supplies. Jackson was talking with the blacksmith when he heard raised voices from the general store. A crowd had gathered. In the center was Eleanor, facing down Margaret Garrett, the wife of the vulture rancher Samuel. Margaret was the undisputed queen of Clearwater society, and her words were like poisoned darts. It is a disgrace, Margaret announced, her voice carrying across the street, parading your condition around like some common farm animal. Have you no shame? I have no patience for small minds, Margaret, Eleanor replied, her voice dangerously calm. You are setting a terrible example for the young women of this town. Good, Eleanor shot back. Perhaps they'll learn they have choices beyond what judgmental busybodies like you dictate. There were audible gasps from the crowd. Margaret's face went beet red. How dare you? Eleanor took a step forward, one hand resting protectively on her belly. No, how dare you? How dare you presume to tell me how to live my life or how to carry my child? This baby will be born to a mother who knows her own worth and who will teach her daughter that her value lies in her strength and her mind, not in her ability to sit quietly and embroider. Jackson pushed through the crowd to her side. Everything all right here? Your wife, Mr. Wade, is making a spectacle of herself, Margaret spat. The only spectacle I see, Jackson said, his voice mild but his eyes hard, is a bunch of folks who ought to be minding their own business. He offered Eleanor his arm. Ready to go home, darling? The word slipped out, but it felt right. Eleanor took his arm, her head held high. As he helped her onto the wagon, she murmured, "Darling, that's new." "Felt appropriate," he said, a grin spreading across his face, "seeing as how you were darlingly putting that old harpy in her place." Her surprised laugh was the best sound he'd ever heard. That winter, they grew closer than ever. Her frustration with her changing body was channeled into planning for the future. She spent her evenings by the fire, surrounded by papers, mapping out an expanded garden, studying breeding lines for their horses, calculating profits. He found her like that one night, an ink smudge on her cheek, her belly round under one of his old work shirts, and the words were just there, demanding to be said. "I love you," he said. She looked up, startled. In all their months of marriage, of passion and partnership, the words had never been spoken. "What?" "I love you," he repeated, kneeling beside her chair. "Not in spite of who you are, Eleanor. Because of it." She set down her pen, her eyes searching his. "Even though I'm not the quiet wife you wanted?" "I was a fool," he said, taking her hands. "I thought I wanted peace and quiet. Turns out, what I really needed was a storm. What I needed was you." She leaned down and kissed him, a long, slow kiss that was full of a tenderness he hadn't known she possessed. "I love you too, Jackson Wade," she whispered. "I have for months. I was just too stubborn to say it." "That sounds about right," he laughed, pulling her into his arms. Later that night, as they lay in bed, she said quietly, "I'm going to keep working after the baby's born. Not as much, maybe, but I won't give it up." "I know," he said, stroking her hair. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The wind howled outside, a lonely winter sound. But inside their small house, everything was warm. Everything was right. The baby kicked, a strong, solid thump against his hand. Spring would be here soon. It would bring their child and a whole new set of challenges.